Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kansas Oil Museum speaker series. I'm Dr. Tim Myers, and I'm a professor at Butler Community College. I'm starting my 32nd year of teaching there. And originally, my topic was going to be on the Indian Wars in Kansas during the 1860s and 70s. But when the coronavirus started, it was during spring break, and I haven't been on campus since then. And they won't let us on campus, and so I couldn't do my research with the pictures and photographs and books that I had, to put a topic together. So maybe next summer that we can discuss that topic. But we were trying to decide what I should be talking about, and since the coronavirus did hit, that we thought, well, let's do a historical survey of, pandemics of the past. So one of the chapters I cover is the late Middle Ages, as you see here up on the screen. And it was a period from about 1300 to 1450, a period of disillusion. It is also crisis. In other words, the Middle Ages was falling apart to some degree. The 1300s was considered the age of adversity, or the age of a calamity. And one of the things that led to that calamity or that adversity was the Bubonic Plague. And that's going to be the major topic here this evening that we're going to be talking about. As you see this picture here, that one of the results of the Bubonic Plague was a series of peasant revolts. There was 4 major ones during this time period, and this is the one. This picture depicts what's called the Jacquerie revolt, which was in 1451. And actually, it was a lot of the peasants were just tired of being overtaxed. And also the English armies had been going through, this is during the time of the 100 Years' War, and they revolted and killed all kinds of nobles and destroyed their castles. And as a result, of course, it took time for the nobles to get an army together, but crushed this revolt. So this is what we see in this picture. Now, anyway, there was a series of different problems that led to the Black Death or the Bubonic Plague during this time period. For instance, there was a little ice age developed. And from about 1300 to 1450, that the climate all over the globe got colder. It affected the world in all kinds of different ways. For instance, it rained too much in certain places, or it didn't rain enough in others, or the frost came too early, or didn't come at all. Sometimes it snowed when it shouldn't, and sometimes there was heavy snow. So in other words, the growing seasons were all messed up. Nature didn't know exactly what to do. And as a result of that, the growing seasons were shorter, you had less crops, so therefore it led to starvation. And as you can see, one of the major things that came from this is the Great Famine, which really a lot of people lost their lives during this time period, the early 1300s. And those that did survive, of course, their immune systems were very compromised as a result of this. I'd like to say some of the other results of this little ice age is from raining too much or not raining enough, the exhaustion of topsoil, as you see there. Animals were dying, so there was a shortage of manure, therefore fertilizer to help the crops grow. And so it hampered agriculture in all kinds of different ways. Also, as you can see here, is that there was a shortage of silver. And so as a result of that, they had to actually debase the coins, which caused a large amount of inflation. So in other words, putting in our colloquial language, is that the dollar had less buying power. In other words, it costs more just to buy simple goods, and particularly the people on the bottom of society were really hurt of being able to buy vegetables, bread, things of that nature that would help sustain life. And also, as a result, prices rose, which again was an area of inflation. and revenues from peasants dropped. In other words, the nobles could not get the revenues that they needed, or the governments, city governments, as well as the kingdoms and so forth. And as a result, as you see what the nobles did to replace those revenues, they preyed upon the peasants. They plundered them, or in some cases, nobles fought each other for resources. Now, let me give you a kind of comparison what was taking place in the Americas at the time. Just since we live in Kansas, that really what happened in America during the Little Ice Age is the fact, same problem. In other words, shorter growing periods. As a result, there was starvation that took place. And also, it brought the buffalo down from Canada into the Great Plains. And as a result of that, then the Indians who lived in the Great Plains really went to more of a hunting type of lifestyle. And they also fought each other for hunting grounds and so forth. So in other words, a lot of tribes were displaced in the Americas at the time. So anyway, also to try to keep other bands from actually attacking you, some tribes would actually ally themselves with each other. Like the Lakota Confederacy is a good example of that, and being able to control large areas of the Great Plains against other rivals and so forth. We could go on into this, but actually buffalo hunting even increased once the horse was introduced by the Spanish conquistadors. Then they went away completely from farming and went to a hunting, warlike type of society. So anyway, that's kind of give you the comparison, you might say, between the old world and what was happening in the new world. There's a chart of the chronology of this whole period. But what I want to key in on is actually just these 4 major peasant revolts that took place as a result of the bubonic plague. Here you have the Peasants' Revolt in Flanders, which would be now the modern state of Belgium, and took place from 1323 to 1328. The peasants revolted because they were starving during the Great Famine, and of course the nobles were putting high taxes upon them. And you can see it was fairly successful for several years. Then you had the Jacquerie, as you see here, in 1358. I think I said 1451 earlier. Sorry about that, wrong date. But the Jacquerie was which actually means jack. It's just a French term meaning the jacks are revolting. The common people. It was a name for a common person back then. So they revolted because it was during, like, say, the 100 Years' War, where England had invaded France and were taking up large amounts of territory, destroying a lot of farmland and so forth, and which also caused starvation. But the nobles, tried to raise revenues from the peasants so that they could fight the British or the English. And of course, it led to this revolt. The other major revolt that took place is in 1378 in Florence. Wool workers were not actually being paid what they should. In other words, there was less people due to the bubonic plague, and so they had to do more work, so they wanted their wages raised. And as a result of that, the nobles said nope, and as a result, they revolted. And they took over Florence for about 5 days until the nobles were able to get an army together and crush this revolt. And then finally, you see the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1382. Similar circumstances, same kind of idea in the other places. So it's really interesting, even this pandemic of the bubonic plague caused upheaval like you wouldn't believe during this time period. So let's talk about the chronology of this period. What took place, how the bubonic plague came to Europe. It actually started in Mongolia, and the Mongolians were raiding and pillaging and plundering all over Asia. They took over China, and as a result, it spread to China. And then as they continued to march west into Central Asia and in also Europe. They actually spread the disease that way. And then, as you see here, that they were trying to take the Genoese colony of Kaffa up in the Black Sea region in 1347. And what took place there is that Mongolian soldiers were dying. And, but anyway, they realized that this pandemic was spreading like crazy. So in order to try to take the city, they actually shot their dead in catapults over the city walls to really spread this disease. But fortunately, the city was able to hold out. In other words, the Mongolians were taking too many casualties and they retreated. But the damage had been done. Genoese sailors who were actually coming back to Europe had contracted disease. At first they were, asymptomatic, but by the time they reached Sicily, they were pretty much all the crews of these ships were either dead or dying or in the process of being very sick. And actually when people came aboard to see why people are not coming off the ships, they contracted the disease as well. And it just spread like wildfire after that. As you can see here, when it reached Europe from 1347 to 51, it wiped out either approximately a fourth to a third of Europe in 5 years' time. And of course, people did not understand what was causing this pandemic. So it, like I say, it was a terrible disease that they didn't know exactly how to deal with it. Matter of fact, many people at the time period, this was a very religious period in European history. Many people felt this was a judgment of God, and they acted accordingly to try to deal with that, repenting of their sins and so forth, which I'll show you a picture of that just a little bit later. But anyway, that's how it was spread. And as you can see here, though, how it started, it actually started with black rats who normally are in the forests. In other words, they live in the forests and they really don't come in contact with human beings that much. But due to the little ice age, they were looking for food. And so they would start going into the cities or where there was human habitation. And as a result, they had fleas that actually carried this disease. So anyway, they would go into these little encampments like in Mongolia and so forth. And so when the rats would die, of course, the little flea, it's trying to say, oh, I need another host. I need to keep food. So, oh, there's a human. Boink. There they go. They jump on a human, and that's the way the disease would spread. Now, interestingly enough, that you would think, well, didn't people realize that a flea bite could cause a pandemic? Well, actually, no. Because at that time period, not only with the Mongolians and Chinese, but all people through Asia, or even in Europe, even people who lived in the cities had close contact with animals of all kinds. They had livestock in their backyards. They had horses. So they were constantly being bit by fleas and didn't think anything about it. So another flea, just wouldn't register to them that, this is going to cause me to die. They didn't really kind of think of it in that way. Now, you would also kind of think, well, they were very filthy, dirty people. In some cases, they were. But that's really a myth that we have about the Middle Ages, especially by the time of the late Middle Ages. People were taking baths. They were more hygienic than we realize. But still yet, being around animals all the time, it really indicated that, they didn't think anything by being bit by a flea. So anyway, that's how it spread. Here it shows you the spread in this map. You can say this is where it first started in Asia. Now, I don't have Mongolia and China over here, but by the time it's really getting into Central Asia, this would be 1346. The next period here is next year is 1347, where it gets into what's now Turkey and actually Greece. And here's that Genoese colony of Kaffa right there, and it's being it contracts, that colony contracts the disease. And then, of course, it goes into Sicily, as I mentioned before. The next year, in 1348, it goes all the way throughout Italy, and then also Spain, areas of France and so forth. And then, of course, the next year, it goes into more Central Europe and also the British Isles. And then eventually it kind of makes a full circle if you realize it. It starts over here, spreads this way, and then goes back into Asia, or what is Russia, which is kind of interesting to me. There's a few little areas that were not affected too much by the pandemic. You can see these little red circles or red dots. In other words, Warsaw, Krakow, Prague was not affected too much by the plague. And you think they would be, but Nuremberg was not either. This little country area in southern France was not affected. And a couple places, what would be now in Belgium. And the reason why is because they practiced quarantining. They didn't let anybody into their cities. And as a result, it couldn't spread. And so anyway, it's probably, it's been controversial where we should open up our states today. But to some extent, of quarantining, social distancing does work. This is a kind of historical proven fact that it does. So, but anyway, nonetheless, where it really hit the most, though, was in the large cities where people came in close contact with each other. And so anyway, that's how it spread. The pathology of this pandemic is really interesting. Yersinia pestis is the actual bacterial infection. Like I said, it normally affects rats, and it is transmitted by flea bites, as we indicated. But also, once people contract this disease, that they could also have what's called the Bubonic Plague. In other words, if you cough, you sneeze, close proximity to people, and you're sneezing and coughing droplets, people are going to get affected that way. And as a matter of fact, that's the way it spread the most. It was actually once it came to the pneumonic phase of people coughing on other people and sneezing on other people and so forth. Now, it's a terrible disease. Reason why it's called the Bubonic Plague or the Black Death. People would develop these bubbles, is the best way to describe it. There's big, huge boils that would be under your armpits, around your stomach area, around the groin or neck. Or another way to put it, anywhere that you have lymph nodes. It attacks your lymphatic system or your immune system is what it does. And so it literally almost destroys your lymph nodes. So as a result of that, you start coughing and sneezing, and of course then it starts affecting your lungs. You don't get oxygen to your bloodstream, and so your body begins to turn blue because of that, or black. And that's the reason why they called it the Black Death. And anyways, you see here, if these boils were not lanced, death would come very quickly. As a matter of fact, you could probably, by the time you started showing symptoms, it would be less than a week in many cases when you would die. You would also, like I say, have high fever. You would almost literally vomit and cough up blood, and then there would be death. And so in some places, the mortality rate would be 90% in some places, especially in the cities where they did not quarantine or keep people out and life tried to continue to go on as usual. Then it would spread like wildfire. Now, interestingly enough, though, they did try to care for the sick, but they didn't know how. They didn't have the scientific knowledge that we even do today to know what to do. So what they would do, try to rid the air, bad air. That had to be the cause. And to rid the body of poison. So they would, bleed people, which was really not the best solution. As a matter of fact, it probably hastened death, if anything. But that would be one thing they would do. In other words, they would try to actually have flowers or other plants that would be aromatic, to keep the disease down. You may have heard the nursery rhyme, ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, okay, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Well, there's, to try to keep the, the plague from coming, you'd have these aromatic, herbs and so forth. They rang church bells, to keep the bad spirits away or demons. They had fire cannons for the same effect, or medicines from plants, which we already indicated to some degree. And actually, they would use magic. A combination of magical letters and numbers. You know, they would repeat this, like abracadabra would be an example, or something of that nature to ward off evil spirits or something. So in other words, it was not very scientific how they dealt with this disease. Now, doctors at this time period would actually wear these huge masks, which is really, we do that today, but their mask on it looked like a mosquito head in some ways. It had these big, huge eyes, and it had these long proboscis. And why would they have their long proboscis, you may ask, is they had the flowers in them, you know, so to have a good smell so that they would not contract the disease. And of course, being around some of these people that were dying, I mean, the smell was atrocious. So that was the reason they had these type of masks, which is very interesting, to say the least. But anyway, nonetheless, the people that were exemplary during this time period, trying to care for the sick, were the clergy. Nuns, priests, monks, friars, were all trying to take care of the sick. Normally during this time period, politically speaking, the Roman Catholic Church was really in decline. There was a lot of criticism of the Pope for some of his decisions and so forth, which I'm not going to go into. That would be a topic for another day. But still, on the local level, the parish priests, monks, and nuns were really trying to do everything they could to take care of the sick. And they, as you notice here, the mortality rate was very high among them. But they didn't give up. They still tried to take care of them. Also, other people, though, the wealthy people, would flee the cities because they see people dying all around them. And they lived in the countryside, hoping that they'd be able to get away. In some cases it worked, other cases it didn't, because they could have already contracted disease before they even left the city. So it all depended in some ways. Cities also closed the gates to people trying to come into the city, like I said. Some of these other, like Prague, that I mentioned earlier, or Warsaw and Krakow, were able to escape all this because they quarantined the cities before the disease spread. So anyway, that was an effective way of being able to kind of keep the disease from spreading. They got to the point of trying to bury people. They were burying so many people each day. They got to the point of burning people. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That goes back to the nursery rhyme. So in other words, to try to keep the rotting bodies and so forth from spreading disease, they would try to bury or in some cases burn the people before that it would spread further. Anyway, other people, as you can see here, just abandoned people. They even mothers and fathers would abandon their children. So anyway, it's a kind of everybody for himself type of attitude in some cases. But anyway, it was really all kinds of bizarre behavior began to take place. Some became super religious. Matter of fact, there was a group that were called flagellance, that they would actually have these whips, and they would go from city to city, whipping their backs all along the way. And in other words, we got to repent of our sins so God will stop this pandemic. And they would encourage others to actually join them. And if they didn't, they would start whipping them against their will in many cases. So they would actually come in cities in the hundreds and thousands sometimes, because they felt that that was the solution to all this, was some religious experience. So anyway, but some, on the other hand, eat, drink, and be merry. If we're going to die, let's party. Let's just really live it up if we're going to die. But anyway, this shows you a hospital of nuns, as you see here, taking care of the sick. So that's one example. And also, what are some of the responses? Well, we indicated one was panic, is that they abandoned their family and friends. Like I say, they tried to, everybody for themselves. There was also new artistic forms focused on decay and mortality. So in other words, that instead of having this idea of like King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table, which is called courtly love, where knights and ladies would, dance and frolic, and, a knight would be the champion of the lady. That seemed to be the really art form earlier than this. Now it changes to be death and dying. Matter of fact, you see skeletons leading all people from all walks of life to the grave. And it seems like there's almost an obsession. And this was called the dance of death in the art form here. But also, too, and one thing that they also did is actually persecute the Jews. In other words, they thought the Jews was the cause of all this, that they were the ones who actually poisoning the wells. So there was actually persecution and killing of Jews at the time, which was a minority that, that lived throughout all of Europe. And so they were not well liked. But anyway, nonetheless, that was what was taking place. As we noticed already, the food production plummeted. And so people, were already hurting their immune systems, and that just made it worse. So it increased probably the mortality rate of the bubonic plague in many ways, by not having enough food and a strong immune system to fight off the disease. So anyway, you see here depopulation increased. So, and so I mentioned this before, what really led to some of these peasant revolts is the fact that it caused all kinds of economic upheaval because the nobles still wanted their income. They weren't willing to take a cut. They felt that, the peasants should continue to live on what they had before. And so it caused upheaval and revolts of all kinds. And we've already talked about these peasant revolts, these different time periods. So not a fun time to live in history. But anyway, this shows you the flagellance right here. The beating their backs and going from town to town saying, hey, repent, repent. And of course, some people joined them voluntarily, but many did not. And here's that dance of death as an example. It's a mural let's see, I think it is in an actual church. But you can see these skeletons and actually leading all people from all walks of life to death. Children, nobles, merchants, you name it. So it didn't matter. Women, it didn't matter. Everybody was going to die. The last slide I'm going to mention here is actually, you can show here they were burying their dead. And so in other words, there was the artwork seems to reflect death, dying, destruction. In other words, they couldn't have a positive outlook on life. In other words, we're all going to die, and so why, try to fight it to some extent. But anyway, what essentially happened is that the plague took its own course. In other words, as it went through that cycle that I showed you on that map earlier, it just kind of died out on its own. People gained immunity to the disease, and it spread back into Asia, where it came from originally. And so anyway, that if we can learn any lessons from this, is the fact that quarantining, social distancing does work. Also, too, if we can learn any other thing, is the fact that as we've kind of noticed in our own society, if you keep people cooped up too long, they will resist that. Now, of course, the protests we had earlier before Mr. Floyd's death had to do with being cooped up, which caused all kinds of economic stress in people's lives, as well as psychological stress. I know for me personally, being cooped up for a long period of time, I'm not a super active person, but still not being able to go where I wanted to and to see who I wanted to did cause me to have some down days. I don't know if I would call it depression, but it really did mess with me psychologically. So anyway, these are some of the things I think we can learn from this. And I noticed too that I watched a film by the BBC on the Spanish flu. And I was wanting to do some comparisons here, just a little bit, if you give me a little bit of time. That actually, I did not realize this, but the Spanish flu, and I'll tell you the reason why it was called the Spanish flu, it didn't originate in Spain. it originated in Kansas, which the patient 0 was a farmer from Haskell County, and he got drafted into the Army, and he was a cook, and he had contracted the disease, and it spread everywhere. And just like the coronavirus, it started with wild game or wild birds, somehow connected to the guy's farm who was had ducks and geese and so forth, and it really affected the domestic fowl, and of course he contracted it that way. And then it just really spread like wildfire in that military camp, and as these guys were going to Europe and going across the ocean, of course it just spread like crazy. And the first phase, interestingly, it hit England terribly. And but anyway, some of the doctors were saying, we need to shut the schools down. We need to shut, the other public places like theaters and restaurants and so forth. But anyway, that these doctors were kind of pretty much ignored, and because they didn't want that to affect morale during the war. And so they just were, these poor doctors were trying to, stop the spread, but they weren't listened to at all. And as a result, it just spread all over the globe eventually. And it's interesting that on that first year, it kind of died down in the summer. And if you've watched the news anytime lately, that we think, well, it's kind of maybe stopping in the summer. But then that next fall in September, it mutated. And the second phase was worse than the first. So by the time that the Spanish flu died out, you might say, as people got herd immunity, and it pretty much killed anywhere. The estimates are, we don't have exact estimates, but at least probably 50 million people, if not more. But anyway, had they quarantined and so forth, done the social distancing early on, perhaps it wouldn't have spread like it did. But anyway, nonetheless, it's something we can learn from the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is that, of course, all the Allies wanted to keep it hush-hush. So they wanted, life to go on as normal. And so anyway, Spain at the time period was neutral. So when the king died, they started to have all kinds of discussion in the newspapers and so forth about what's causing it, how can we treat it, and so forth. So it got the term Spanish flu, but it really has nothing to do with Spain that much. And I did not realize that it actually started here in Kansas, the patient 0. But anyway, those are some of the things that when a pandemic starts, you've got to nip it in the bud almost immediately. And because once it spreads, it's anybody's game at that point, whether you survive or don't survive. So anyway, I hope this has been a good discussion. And I hope you've learned something from it. Feel free to actually ask any questions, and I'll try to answer them the best I can. But anyway, have a good evening, and I hope you look forward to watching the next lecture in this series.